Many of us are probably familiar with that biblical story of Pharaoh's bread maker and his drinks master, but how many of us actually think about how those two represent a conflict, a cultural conflict about different drinks? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore on this 116th episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Dr. Jon Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg, welcome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. For those less familiar with Dr. Greenberg here, he runs Torah.org, which we'll get into in a moment. He received his bachelor's degree with honors from Brown University and his Masters and Doctorate in agronomy from Cornell University. He has also studied with Rabbi Chaim Brovender at Israel's Yeshivat Hamivtar, conducted research on a bunch of plants at Cornell, the USDA, UPenn, and since 2009, he's been a science teacher and educational consultant. Dr. Greenberg, editor of science textbooks at Prentice Hall Publishing, previously in the faculty of Yeshivas Ohr Yosef, the School of Education at Indiana University, Go Hoosiers, and the University of Phoenix. He is Heschel School since 2008. In 2021, he published Fruits of Freedom, a Passover Hagadah with a commentary from the perspective of the history of Jewish food and agriculture. He is a frequent speaker at synagogues, schools, and botanical gardens. So actually, and where does Torah Flora fit into all this?
That's what Torah Flora is.
So it's the
agronomy and Torah.
So the idea behind Torah Flora is sort of that the intersection of.
Right. I like to describe it as science in the service of Torah. Oh. So we're using the science, the history, and secular knowledge, not to critique Torah, but to enhance our understanding and appreciation.
Oh, wonderful. And that is exactly what we're doing in this conversation. So, and I will say, I heard you speak on this, and I thought I had to bring this to the listeners of Drinking Show, of this sort of not necessarily interplay, sort of almost like a cultural conflict between wine and beers, and really how it sort of plays out in a story I think a lot of us are familiar in one way or another. But the story of, I want to say Joseph and sort of his jailmates, as it were. Mm-hmm. But how would you describe this?
Well, I would start much farther back. I would start in the Stone Age.
Okay.
People were first, before agriculture, before food storage, before fire was mastered, people would walk around, pull off the seeds from tall stalks of grasses that were growing, and they would collect them, and then they could eat them. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, much later, they learned to breed the grains that we have today: wheat, barley, oats, corn, rice, and so on, parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Now, once you'd collected these things, first you wanted to cook them. You had to eat them. Now, when they're young and soft, you can eat them raw. For example, corn on the cob, if you take it right from the field when it's really fresh, you don't even have to cook it. You can eat it raw. It's so sweet. But as time went by, people learned that these things could be improved by cooking once they'd mastered fire. So what they would do was they would cook a kind of a porridge and gruel. And I should mention Patrick McGovern, by the way, analytical chemist and an archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania, has written a book about this, arguing that civilization began primarily under the influence of the driving force of the search for beer. Mm-hmm. That was really what led to civilization. And some people would continue to maintain today that's the accomplishment. That's a debatable point, but people certainly feel that way. So what happened? So they had this thin, like barley soup or something like that. That they would drink, and then they had leftovers. Obviously, there was no refrigeration. So what did they do? Well, there were two possibilities. You had to let it sit around, because unless you were going to consume it on the spot, there was no alternative. Now, if it was very thick and doughy, discovered you could put it back in the fire, and then that became the first bread. It was essentially dough. And natural yeast produces spores that are all over the place. They're everywhere on dust, and some of this would fall in and begin to ferment. So you'd get some rising, it'd be softer and easier to eat. Mm-hmm. Or if it didn't really form a doughy mass, it would form a thick liquid, then the same reaction would take place, and what you would get was a primitive kind of beer. So people liked these things. They were a good source of calories and other nutrients. So now this one is from 4000 BC, but the same thing. You can see a very large ceramic pot compared to the size of the two people there. Notice they're drinking from the same pot through straws. You can see two people standing by the ceramic pot drinking through straws. So the whole village would gather around, and this is still in some villages in Western China, and drink from a shared pot. Things come out of this that are sort of interesting. First of all, because they're all drinking from the same pot, you can't poison just one person. Right? An element of trust here. right?
Yeah.
And some people have argued that the toasting can be traced back to this Stone Age technology, that when you toast, you're reuniting all the glasses, as if to say, we're all drinking from the same source here and we trust each other.
Yeah.
The other thing is these straws. This is not a straw like you get a plastic straw, your soda. This is a real, literal, hollow grass stem. And why are they drinking straws? Nobody does that today. Because all the chaff and debris from the grain has floated to the top. You can't just pour it off, and it's a mess. You wouldn't want to drink that. That's why they basically pierces through that to the bottom, and men and children would all gather around and drink this. Okay, now here's the problem. That's not sealed. The technology for closing up beer to preserve the carbonation and the alcohol didn't many centuries later. So this was a drink for peace, farmer. Now, if you were a nomadic shepherd, like the early Israelites, right? You couldn't carry this thing around on the back of a camel. It would see and it would spill, right? So their drink was not beer. Their drink was wine, all right? So here you see, for example, an early terracotta figurine here from the Israel Museum, from an exhibit. You can see 4 amphorae, the Greek-style clay jugs on the back of the camel, and it looks like a Barbary ape from Morocco, maybe, being off somewhere to be sold. So wine was portable, beer was not, right? So now what happens? So now you have this culture conflict beginning to develop. You have these two groups who hate each other, first of all. This is the oldest conflict in the world. This is Cain and Abel, right? The farmer versus the nomadic herder, the enclosure movement in British history, the range wars in the United States. We see this in West Africa also. The Tuareg, who were these sort of nomadic chiefs, wander around the Sahara and dominate the oases. So these people want a free range to travel around with their flocks. And the farmers want to put a fence around their fields because they have a concept of land ownership. So very different cultures and very different beverages, wine and beer. Herders couldn't brew beer, wouldn't make wine themselves, but they could trade for it. Wine wasn't so portable, right? So, but beer was kosher. It was what we might call kosher but goyish. Right? You drink it once in a while, but it's not for, they drink that. We don't drink that, right? And to this day, first and foremost is wine, not beer.
Although see the term sheikhar, beer, appear more than times throughout Tanakh.
Right. So there's an interesting question about that. So the most common yayin and sheikhar refer to grape juice and wine. But there are chamra. In the Gemara, we see the term chamra de Medina, the alcoholic drink of the capital. And that was probably beer. That was Rome. So here again, you see this. The Greeks were wine drinkers. The Romans had both beer and wine. They also had a drink. It's not made much. It's a kind of a fermented date beer. Company in Israel has revived this. It's mentioned in the Talmud how sick they would get when they drank it. It comes up again and again. You wonder, why didn't you just stop? But they didn't.
Well, it will say. Well, first of all, I want to back up. Listeners can check out episodes 26 and 20, or actually 27 and 28 about beer in the Bible and the archaeological conversations about that. But also speaking about in the Talmud, episode 20 about beer and Havdalah. So there were someone gave like a date beer that was like a really nice date beer, like an early Amora, early 3rd century. And he's amazing. You could sing all these songs. You could do, all these things. And then he had stomach aches. Yeah. But there were plenty of rabbis that we see who are, whether those are brewers, but if not, they drink beer. And that's even in the Talmud.
Right. So remember, this is long after the period. It really ends with Joshua.
Right.
So that's when the land is divided up and they settle down and become farmers.
Yeah. So that's the Talmud. But even the Bible itself, I mean, our listeners can check out episodes 27, 28 on gin and beer. But even so, it's initially in Leviticus 10 and then elsewhere in the Bible as far as it was. I mean, as you pointed out, it's something that's been around for thousands and thousands of years and maybe. And so it was, whether they necessarily drank it or not, it was certainly in their on their cultural radar.
Oh, for sure. They for sure drank it. It wasn't didn't have the same prestige as wine. And I think it still doesn't for most people. So
I was going to say, especially in the Bible, look, the par excellence is clearly wine. It's not even, it's head and shoulders above any other beverage, but still beer is there.
Sure. Right. Now in Egypt, it was the reverse, which is interesting because what happened was So here you had a culture that developed in one place, not a nomadic herding culture, but a sedentary agricultural culture that, as beer, became very skilled at producing beer and bread. Brewers, were also bakers, and they were very respected officials, and part of the religion. So we have, for example, the goddess Hathor. Okay, here are several pictures of Hathor. So one of the things that's typical of the Egyptian gods is that they're kind of legible. You'll see the depictions change over time. You see the picture okay here? Right, okay. So on the bottom right, the earliest form, she's represented as a cow. You can see the sun disk or horns, which indicates the divinity of Ra, the sun god. That's her father. And you see the papyrus, and hiding down the papyrus, a small figure, one of the other gods, who she hid there while he was in trouble. And when he grew up, she married him. But she is associated with all pleasurable activity. And you see here, he's actually drinking the wine right from the cow's udder, the milk. But she's also with beer, with sexuality, and it has a connotation of. Now, as time went by, the depictions became more human. So the picture on the left, you can see the cow-like ears are still there, but and the milk theme is sort of muted. That 1960s bouffant hairstyle with the curled hair, the symmetrical on either side, suggestive, I think, of breasts, and that was part of attention. And the top right, again, you see her. Much more subdued picture, but with the still between the horns there. Okay, so she was a beer goddess, all right? And there's a whole story about her. So this became part of the religion. Also in Mesopotamia, there was a beer goddess called Ninkasi. So it's interesting. I guess we can digress for a minute about this because it's an interesting story. There's certain stories from religions that get a wider circulation than among the believers of those religions. So for example, I would say almost every American child, whether they had a religious upbringing or not, knows the story of Noah's Ark and may have a toy, a little boat with little animals and play with, right? So that's a story that's very well known beyond its actually devotional really. So there's a similar one in the Egyptian mythology called the destruction of humanity. Sounds like fun bedtime reading, right? So the story is that Ra, the sun god, was angry that humanity was not respect authority. So he sent his daughter to earth to kill a few people and put the fear of gods. Now, one of the things they did with their beer in Egypt was beer that was used for sacramental purposes was flavored or colored to give it a red color. And that was a sort of a kind of beer. So he sent Hathor to earth to kill some people who would respect him more. And he got going and got very excited. And eventually got into this kind of bloodlust friend point that no one could stop her, and Ra was afraid she would be buddy. He poured this red beer over the earth, the old Sherwin-Williams ad, pouring the paint over, same idea, right? Pour this red beer all over the earth. So she thought it was blood, drank it, got drunk and stout, and humanity was saved. So this is the big touchstone text of Egyptian mythology. And about this is that every single is completely inverted in the Exodus. Right? Ra's the sun god, big shot, darkness. Right? The Nile is the source of life, and we have beer. We're going to turn the Nile red, and it's going to become undrinkable. Right? If you get Hathor is a beer goddess, we're not touching beer for a week. It's dead. So everything in there gets inverted. So part of the Torah's agenda is to demythize all these natural phenomena and free them from that kind of polytheistic, superstitious content.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
Okay, now Yosef and Eretz Canaan from Canaanites. So there's a small, I
was going to say, for me, as someone who's actually taking a more drinking lens, has become really fascinated by the Sarah Mashkin. So that's where I'm coming from.
Right. It's very interesting what happened there. So we have this woman in Canaan, and so Yaakov tells his sons, "You got to go. They have food there." Right. So how did Yosef get there to be there in position to save them? So he was, of course, sold by his brothers into slavery and down to Egypt. Now, at this time, had a political problem. What happened was that earlier than this, Canaanites and Hittites and other people from the north had come down to Egypt initially to trade, and when Egypt was a great commercial power, but not yet a military power so much. So it was wide open. And as these northerners, they were called Hyksos, was kind of a corrupted mint form, came into trade. They began to establish their own settlements in northern Delta area, and eventually established their own kingdom and challenged the Egyptian pharaoh. They had their own pharaoh. So they came down dressed to kill. And it's interesting to see what they looked like when they got there, because it has bearing on the story of Yosef. So let me show you a picture from an Egyptian tomb painting of Hyksos, Canaanites, Israelites, people from the north. These are very likely Israelites. You'll see why in a moment. Okay, so you can see these people. Let's get this out of the way here. All right, notice beards and heads of hair, not like the typical male figures you see in the Egyptian paintings, usually the shaved heads and shaved faces. Notice the very ornate patterns on the clothing, and the women in the back also, children also wearing a bright lot of red, right? Yeah. And you can see the livestock in the road. These are pastoral. Okay, so this is what they went for when they came to trade. And this is what impressed the artist. These Hyksos come down here from Canaan to trade with us, and they come in these striped, multicolored outfits. Well, Yosef got there too, but he lost his fancy outfit on the way. That may be what Ketona really looked like. We have a depiction from an eyewitness here. What happened? So he gets the Hyksos pharaoh has a dilemma. They assert their authority over the native Egyptians who stayed in the north under their. Farther south in the Upper Nile, there was resistance. There was still a pharaoh. He rose up and drove them out. But before that happened, they were pretty strongly entrenched. So here's the dilemma of the colonial power. How do you assert your power of these people and get them to accept your authority? So there are two basic strategies. One is accept some of their culture onto yourself so they'll recognize you as one of them. And the second is, if you believe that your culture leaders generally do, culture on them so they can be enlightened by your superior knowledge and customs. So you do that. Well, good red-blooded Egyptians drink beer, and Hyksos drink wine, just like the Greeks. So we got to civilize these people and get them to drink wine. So one party argued in favor of wine. The other party argued in favor of absorbing Egyptian customs and drinking. And there was apparently quite a debate going on in the palace about this, because the chief advocates, the beer advocate, who was, of course, had a vested interest, the brewer, right, the chief brewer, and the wine advocate, the wine steward. So this was going to keep them in. So they had conflicting businesses. So
now I'm curious. Jailmates are, one is the Saramashkim, he's the guy, and the other is you're saying the baker, he deals with the grains.
The baker is the brewer, right? So they made two kinds
of grains,
bread.
Whether it's bread or beverage, it's
right. So what they used to do, they made two kinds of bread. And these are in the tombs. One was for eating, and the other was just a way of preserving the grain for future. They look like dog biscuits. They didn't dry, but that way it was preserved. And when you were ready to make the beer, you go up and cook it and make a wort, and then you eventually could. Yeah,
and I that. For listeners, episodes 27, 28, I was shocked to hear that that's how they brewed in the biblical times. They biscuits and then dissolve them into drinkable beer.
Right. Yeah. So at some of the Egyptian settlements in Israel, they found evidence. What identified them as settlements ultimately was they found these ceramic colanders that were used in beer making. So wherever you found one of those, that was an Egyptian settlement. There was, a goyish mashka. So that meant the Egypt had been there. So they found a lot of these before they figured were. Okay, so now the two parties are going head to head, fed up, arguing in front. Get out of my face! Jail. I'll make my own decision. See this fall safe, right? Sees his opening, right? So a lot is coming out of this. And Saramashkin, right, the wine steward. So he describes his dream where the vine grows rapidly, goes through all its stages quickly and produces wine. He crushes the grapes in his hand and serves the wine to Pharaoh, right? And he ultimately gets his job back, right? So that seemed to. So Yosef, of course, is welcomed by this Pharaoh because he's a fellow Canaanite, right? It's interesting. Guys, one of his servants, Potiphar in the Torah 3 times in 2 verses, I think it is. He's Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man. Isn't that kind of obvious? Why does the Torah have to emphasize that?
Okay.
Well, we have the inscription of the Pharaoh who drove the Hyksos out eventually. And his fury primarily was directed not at the Hyksos, but at the Egyptians who served him, the Hyksos, under occupation. And they saw them as traitors. So like Potiphar were the real losers when the Hyksos were eventually expelled. And then when did this happen? Right? A new Pharaoh recognized Yosef. Why? Because he wasn't one of the Hyksos. After the Egyptians drove the Hyksos out, now had a cleansing, and every foreigner was either kicked out of the country, killed, or enslaved, including the Israelites who had backed the wrong horse. Right now, the colonial elite becomes the whipping boy. So they were in bad shape. So that things began to deteriorate very quickly from that point on. By the time we get to Moshe, there's no mention of wine at all, because there was this kind of very aggressive cultural cleansing to get rid of these foreign influences. They had wine even before this, but it wasn't the real national pride the way beer was. It wasn't part of it wasn't something really valued there. So occasionally the wealthier people would drink it. Beer was the real mainstay.
So so for me, I'm still trying to process. Like I've just been the conflict between let's say the baker and the beverage guy. So he's not necessarily. So you think he's not all beverages? He does the wine products, whereas the baker does the grain products.
Really, right. And we have some pictures. Actually, I can show you some of the tombs of these are from Pharaoh's tombs, Pharaohs to the gods. And you see in one it's bread and the other it's beer. It's funny when you first see it, it looks like it's a giant hamburger. It's not a big roll. It's not really what. Here is a pharaoh bringing a ladder to Hathor, the beer goddess. She's seated at left there, very human, right? That big platter. If you look closely on the bottom layer on that big plate that the pharaoh is carrying, a little round breads. On top of that, you can see there's chicken or some kind of poultry, and in the top center there's some figs and what looks like a pomegranate. So he's bringing a whole platter of this stuff to Hathor, the beer goddess, right? That's his offering to her. And we have another one of another pharaoh. Darker, a little harder to see. You look carefully at this one. You see he's holding two blue cups, one in each hand. An animal-headed god on the left there, that's Horus, the sky god, receiving two cups from the pharaoh. So these things, beer and bread, all come together in these typical same kind of social setting of the two pictures. That is the offering of the pharaoh to the gods. You give them beer, you give them bread. This is the national pride of Egypt. I mean, to have a holiday like Passover in Egypt, say we're going to have a holiday where we don't drink beer and we don't eat bread. It's like going to France and saying I don't drink wine. I'm going to Texas and saying I don't like football. It's like an insult to the national pride.
Right. And that's something that's really stuck with me, especially I'm probably not the only one out there that misses their beer for this week. Well, it's really almost like 10 plus days, but for this entire period of time, it's obviously people talk about not being part of their lives or pizza, but beer very much is something to be avoided. And obviously it's an Egyptian thing. So it's funny because we talk about when it comes to Passover very much about this is commemorating our departure from Egypt, but there's almost this negation of Egyptian culinary objects too.
Absolutely. Right. There's a fascinating comment on this by Brovender. He talks about the Korban Pesach, his commentary on Chumash, he talks about the Korban Pesach. And he says, what's about is why the Torah gives us both a positive commandment about how it's to be cooked, right? We have a commandment to broil it directly over fire. And immediately after that, a negative commandment, do not cook it any other way. That's a big deal. There aren't very many of those. Shabbat is one, and that's huge, right? Yeah. So you have a positive and a negative commandment for the same action. Right? So it tells you this is a big, so he tries to explain it to people in the Spanish court. And he used to hear the gospel about what went on there. And he heard the way the king, and he describes a double boiler, basically, a bain-marie, where they would gently poach these fillets of meats of various kinds. It was steamed and cooked gently in a double boiler. So it was a very sophisticated kind of cuisine. Korban Pesach, the most primitive kind of cooking you can imagine. You stick a piece of meat, a whole carcass actually, on a stick over a right? I mean, you really, so it's as if to say, we recognize that Egypt has great material and cultural accomplishments, but we don't care because in the final analysis, Egypt will be judged like every other nation on moral grounds. And this is a society of fear and superstition and slavery. And so we will prefer to go back to the primitive, Bedouin material culture of our ancestors than to stay and be part of this. It's a kind of rejection of, we recognize your art, your architecture, but this is not what's more important, And part of the contest between Pharaoh and God is about these material accomplishments versus kind of a moral or spiritual kind of judgment. So it's a challenge to values. So Brovender sees them in the Korban. And another piece to that also, which is that was one of the gods, right? Kurdi was one of the fiercest gods. He had a ram's head. And we can tie it up for 3 days and rub their nose in the fact to say, see that, we're going to do with that animal? It's not God anymore. It's dinner.
That's good. So with the Sarah Mashkin winning out over the baker, it's obviously the Pharaoh deciding that, is that supposed to be a literary reflection of sort of the Jews being able to survive, or Yosef? What's at play there? I think
so, right? I think it's sort of asserting superiority of Canaanite and Hitterite culture over Egyptian culture. That was that wine drinking is more civilized and superior drinking. I like to picture that the person defying a guy who comes, I don't know, somewhere in the Midwest to New York and goes into a restaurant and see they're charging $100 for a lunch. Get this, I'm going to stand out in front of this place and eat a corn dog on a stick just to thumb my nose at these snobs, So I think that's very much beer also in America today. That's a working man's drink, Wine is for these sort of urban elites. And I think it still has some of those kind of cultural connotations of social class.
There are some expensive beers these days, though.
Yeah, that's true.
Hello. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to break in again and see if hopefully you're enjoying it. And in the past, I've asked if anybody has any ideas of what Jewish drinking can do beyond the show, beyond different things we can do. But we have the added benefit, the added bonus that Jewish drinking is now an officially recognized 501c3 organization by the IRS. So that means it is now tax deductible if you want to make donations, and we can see what we can do, what new things we can do. So I'm always open, and you are welcome to email me, to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Hopefully you reach out to me, and I'm always open to questions, ideas, suggestions, anything you might have. So please feel free to reach out to me, and thank you. And now back into the show.
I'm going to ask you something now that I want to share this with you. Something you've probably, nothing crazy here, but this is one of the few times of the Torah, the 5 books, that we see people getting drunk. So obviously the first chapter 9 of Genesis with Noah, we later see it not described as getting drunk, but it's drunk in chapter 19 with Lot. But later in Genesis 43, we see Joseph all getting drunk. But what's really, and they're in the palace, right? Yeah. But it does specify the beverage that they are drinking, which is so often say that they're drinking beer. It goes entirely unspecified what they're drinking, and they get drunk from it, but it's ambiguous as to what they're drinking. They got drunk. They got drunk with them. And it's one of the few, example getting drunk, and yet there's no beverage specified. So it's ambiguous as to, was it beer like the Egyptians, or did them? We don't know.
It's true. It's beer. And I think, I'll say a couple of things about this. Yeah. I think if I had to choose, I would more for wine here, because I think part of what he was trying is, it says, press them, knew the order of their ages when he sat. He's trying to say, I know you guys, don't mess with me. I know who you are. I know who's your brothers, I know your relationships. And so if he's looking for this connection with them, it seems to me he would drink wine rather than beer with them. Israelites in Egypt, very conscious of their status as foreigners and in a various situation, you could throw them in jail at any moment. I think it would make sense that he's trying to stress that. I would guess wine here. The other interesting thing about this is that these the way they drank, sorry, about Pharaoh's cup. We have Pharaoh's cup, not that Pharaoh. We have Tutankhamun's cup. I have a picture of it here. I can show you.
By the way, share is one of the commentators, Forno, says, well, they were drinking royal wine, which is a higher level of alcohol than they're used to drinking. So that's why they got drunk. Because otherwise, if you get invited to the Pharaoh's palace, or you're all invited and you all end up getting drunk, it may not be an appropriate behavior or not, but certainly Forno says, maybe the royal wine here.
Yeah, so there was a whole issue about diluting wine. One possibility is that it was stronger in ancient times. I think, to me, this is hard to believe because I can't imagine that their yeast was so much more effective than ours is in alcohol.
The wine dilution, that's a Roman practice.
Right. So so they were diluting it. And the fact is that people just hadn't genetically developed a tolerance for it that is common nowadays. So that it probably wasn't all that much stronger than what we have now.
I mean, we can speculating. I mean, the sense that I have right now, my working theory is that the Greco-Roman society developed it because it's more of like a courage, almost like a soda kind of. And this is what everybody drinks all the time. And we see, I mean, most, it's interesting amongst the Tanaim, the early rabbis, we get Rabbi Eliezer that says, if it's not diluted, it's not wine. It needs, that's the way proper civilized people drink, and only, barbaric people drink it undiluted. So I think there's a certain, like a social status thing, that the appropriate way to drink it is diluted. There's
a lot there. And one of the issues among the Greek was that they had an agenda that was announced in advance, and you didn't want the guests to get drunk before they'd had their intellectual discussions. Mm-hmm. So the host had to kind of judge who was coming, where they could hold their liquor, and how much to dilute it.
Fair balance. You need enough to get the conversation going, but not too much to stifle it. Right.
But it continues. Michael and Shakespeare, Falstaff goes to Mistress Queen, and they have to qualify the wine, and that means they would dilute it. They're also deacidifying the water was treated with ground limestone to raise.
Was it hard water?
I don't know if it was a question of hard. Well, it would be hard water, but they were intentionally treating it to raise the pH. I think the wine was very acidic, and they weren't used to that. Tutankhamun's drinking cup. This was probably used in his day primarily for beer, but he may have had wine in it as well. I don't think it looks pretty clean, so I don't know if we can extract anything from there. But you can see there are all kinds of inscriptions there. This is, everything the Pharaoh did had religious significance. So just to have a drink was already a sacramental act. Well, you can see they're very elaborate. It's made of alabaster, nicely decorated. And he was buried in his wine cup. So McGovern has found King Midas was a real magical powers, but he was a very wealthy king of Greek culture who lived in what is today Turkey. And when they excavated his tomb, and they found that this guy loved to drink, we know, because he was buried with his beer mug.
It's good to be the king.
That's real dedication. And so McGovern got his hands on this, and so I'll give it back to the residue. So he was able to analyze it. And are you familiar with McGovern's relationship with Dogfish Head?
I've read that. There was a famous New Yorker article. Over a decade ago, there was a New York article that discussed the Midas, that beer that Doc made.
Right. Yeah. See, but what's interesting was that he found he was apparently drinking a kind of beer wine hybrid. Didn't necessarily distinguish the two, and it had the color was saffron, which of course is expensive. So substituted turmeric when Dogfish had produced their product. But there are a number of these that they produced that were beer wine hybrids.
Look, they didn't have Reinheitsgebot. Reinheitsgebot around for a half millennium. This German purity law about beer. So, and this was thousands. I mean, that's one of the great things about honey is it can boost your fermentable sugars. And that's been common, throughout. I was going to say beer history, but people still do it a little bit nowadays. Although honey's pricey, but it's a great way of boosting sugars.
Honey. Yeah, I was saying about beer and grape juice and barley were both used.
You're saying even throwing wine with beer also? It's
a beer wine hybrid.
Oh, neat. Okay.
Right. So he identified traces of both grapes and barley in there, a lot of spices, coriander, and I don't know what else. I don't remember. Mm-hmm. So he would give the recipes, the list of ingredients to Dogfish Head, and they would have to come up with the recipe. It's not. They don't really want to focus on it. It's not where the real business is, but it's an interesting line.
Right.
So
that's a really cool category, is like our beers.
They go away. I mean, they come every few years. Someone comes out with one, and and then it disappears. It kind of fads.
Right. It's probably more of a gimmick than it is necessarily full or good for margins.
Right. There are people who think it's cool and they'll buy one or two, and then that's the end of it.
Yeah.
So I use, to give an idea, when I do the Torah Flora, we use lambics just as an approximation of what that would have been like, and you can get
the open air fermentation.
Well, because it's fruit for beer with a fruit flavor. That's a little bit like, and the Samuel Adams has one that's pretty easy to find, most dairy wheat, which is pretty easy. And the Linden tastes like soda to me. It's too sweet. I don't taste beer in it. But this is better. So it gives you at least a sense of what that might have been like.
Yeah, because so Belgian beers are so much more fun than German beers. So the Belgian beers, I mean, you have different regions, including the region, but you also have lambics, and lambics have a variety within them, including a lot of them do this just open air fermentation. Whatever yeast is around and has fun with the beer. So, yeah,
that was probably the original. I mean, no one knew anything about yeast, way back when. It's kind of remarkable. It was only in the 19th century that you could go to the store and buy yeast. That it's a very recent development.
And then, of course, right here in Cincinnati, we have a Jewish family, the Fleischmans. So they made a whole business off of yeast.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything else I want to mention about the Egypt story. So I think Ravenel's comment is right. Is the idea that a big part of the Torah's agenda is this whole incident of the Exodus is about this contest between God and Pharaoh, and it's about demythologizing nature and all of these magical things, and that it's all about. It's just stuff, that and those things not. And much of it comes out in terms of the beer.
This cultural plays itself out through wine versus beer.
Sure, right. Yeah, you can see also that just as beer was not portable, the other thing you can't do if you're a nomad is keep bees. You mentioned honey, right? So that was collected mostly from wild bees, and just like Samson did, or you have you find a hollow tree and you can collect honey from that. And it apparently took quite a while, because you don't see much reference in Tanakh after the time of Yeshua about Jews raising bees until the Mishnah, really. Where you see numerous examples, but nothing really before that. So it took a long time to overcome the cultural bias. And we know on the other side, there's an excavation near Beit Shan where they found an ancient Canaanite village. It must have been a horrible place to live. There was really industrial production there. They found there was a wall. It was not part of the wall to it. And they were able to beeswax and pollen down in there. Apparently, people were forced to live in this among millions of bees and produce huge quantities of honey presumably for some very powerful king. So this was, you can see the contempt of the rural nomadic Israelites for these people who lived under these conditions. We would never do that. So, and you can feel good about yourself and say, of course, we don't king like that. We have our king is an invisible God. It's not a king of flesh and blood who can impose this kind of cruelty on us. But by the Mishnah times, the social prejudice against beekeeping it begins to from that kind of kosher but goyish can be replaced there by other things, but lots of examples in the Mishnah of beekeeping.
Dr. Greenberg, this has been very insightful, very fascinating. And before we go, anything you want to promote?
Yes. So a lot of this, what I've been telling you, was based on the research I did for Fruits of Freedom, the Torah Flora Hagadah. So this is a Haggadah I published in 2021 with my commentary based on the history of Jewish food and agriculture. You can see on the cover picture, I wanted to convey the ancient Egyptian agriculture at the bottom. You can see the slaves picking grapes and harvesting fish from the artificial pond and bringing all the food to you crush on the grapes to produce wine, and then bringing all the products to the Pharaoh and the queen on the left. And at the top, Jewish farmers, independent on their own land in modern Israel. So that's where I really got deeply into this. You can see the text of the commentary is very clear. You can see here the footnotes is where the dirty work is. If you want to alumnus, the references to Gemara and to scientific papers and other things at the bottom. Is what does it mean features. So this is things that we do at the Seder that have changed their meaning. I explain those in terms of what does it mean. Practice at the top, that's a banana plant that's been cut down. You can see the leaves coming up. You see there's no woody trunk there. Banana is not really a tree. It's Borei Pri Adama, not Borei Pri. Which is the whole story about the New Jersey Seder plate with a banana for karpas. This is we can get into this. That's to do with pastoral nomads and a toxic weed that poisons. That's the symbol for Avodah Zarah. Here you can see the meaning of red and white wine is a whole deep symbolism we didn't get into maybe another time. Elijah. This is the Yom Hagadah with Chametz. This is Haman's eyes. Moroccan Purim bread. It's brought to the table, and before you can wash for the bread, somebody rips out the eggs and eats for Haman's eyes. This is a historical thing. This is Zayak Nahaz, another story, and the dream of the Saramashkin, of course, the different stages of the development of the grapes. And then, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I put this information. My website is torahflora.org. If you click on Haggadah there, you can see all about the Haggadah, or a list of my events that are coming up there on torahflora.org if anybody wants to get in touch.
All right. Well, Dr. Greenberg, this was fascinating, insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Absolutely. And
I am. Amen.